During a press conference yesterday, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis suggested doctors who perform gender-affirming surgery on transgender children should be sued. Let's watch.
Talk about these very young kids getting gender-affirming care. What they don't tell you what that is they're actually giving very young girls double mastectomies. They want to castrate these young boys. That's wrong. And so we've stood up and said, both from the health and children well-being perspective, you don't disfigure 10, 12, 13-year-old kids based on gender dysphoria. 80% of it resolves anyways by the time they get older. So why would you be doing this? I think these doctors need to get sued for what's happening. I'm sorry.
So, and this is a hot button culture issue. Obviously, I don't think doctors should be sued, obviously. I do think 10, 12, 14 sounds pretty young to me to be going through with difficult to reverse surgery, some irreversible surgeries for young people. Look, I think that's between them, their families, their doctors. That sounds pretty young to me. The recommended age, as far as I can tell, is not till they're like 16 and 18. You're supposed to use the puberty blockers to prevent the changes from happening. If you're someone who is who thinks that's going to be an option you're going to elect for later in life is a surgery. That seems to be the best. Now, though, even those puberty blockers can have. There's the medical community is debating what kind of changes are possibly not reversible in terms of your sexual health, your ability to reproduce. I think the science is not at all settled on that. So I absolutely take DeSantis' point that young kids doing surgery it should be very cautiously pursued, if pursued at all.
But the thing is, this is just throwing red meat to his red base, which doesn't care about this when it's not presented in such a provocative way. And it's really important to note that this is not happening. Young kids are not having surgery. And this isn't something that's easy to access. There's tons of screening. There are tons of medical societies and organizations that have many guidelines. It's not like a kid wakes up one day and is like, hey, can I have some surgery? And then they throw the kid down and have surgery. Also, if he cared about kids, he'd care about kids having access to gender-affirming care. Mm-hmm. People who want to transition, it's not an easy decision that they just make one day. And if he cared about kids, he'd want them to be able to access the care that they want. And that care involves a lot of screening and a lot of discussing. And I think that, this is just an issue that there's a lot of moral panic around it. And again, he's throwing around statistics. This 80% resolving is not true. I don't know what he's citing, but it's not 80% of people who want gender affirming care do not then say, I don't want it anymore. I don't know where that's coming from. I think they're kids who experiment with pronouns, let's say, are non-binary. That's very different from people who want to medically transition. So maybe that's what he's referring to.
So that's what the statistic is. My understanding is, because I have seen that statistic before, and I've seen it reported by responsible people, people opinions I generally trust. I think, yes, what it means is that young people who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria, 80% of them later no longer have gender dysphoria. So these are people who, the idea being, might have gone through with surgery if it had been rushed on them, or if it had been, and then would have regretted it because most of them don't actually need surgery. My position on this has always been that the surgery, actually going all the way through with transition, seems to me to be the right option for a very small number of people for whom it does help their mental health and their sense of self. That's almost a separate issue from what I think a lot of parents are upset about, and a lot of conservatives and DeSantis type people, which is more the kind of just casual erosion of gender at all, or the tendency to now take a little girl who likes playing with trucks or a little boy who likes playing with dolls and say, oh, well, you might actually be a woman, or you might actually be a man. That is not, that is weird, and in some ways, almost strengthening gender norms in a way that doesn't make sense. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I do think that he's mixing metaphors here, and he's very, he wants people to think, from that sound clip, he wants people to think that little kids are getting surgery. And even the terms that he uses, which again, these are things when people decide to have surgery, which is not something kids are doing or have access to. There's so many barriers to that. But when they do, they don't consider it. It's not disfiguring when it's surgery that you want. I mean, people modify their bodies all the time. People have breast implants, they have breast reductions, like everyone in Hollywood has had surgery. So that's another thing. I mean, I think,
and I'm fine with it, but you have to be 60, you have to be able to consent to doing it,
and
right?
That's what happens. You have, so all this moral panic, it's disproportionate because the numbers of there are no kids who have access to surgery. Kids can't have surgery. You can't have the surgery until you're older. So it really does seem like a moral panic, and it seems like a fabricated hysteria that just lets people like DeSantis distract from the issues that people actually care about, that actually impact people's lives. I mean, it's so irrelevant what is happening when people are getting gender-affirming care. It has no impact on anyone except for the person who's doing it. And again, it's not like there are all these medical consultations that happen. I think he really wants to create the impression, a lot of people who are drumming transphobia really want to create the impression that kids are just walking into operating rooms getting surgery. The reality is so far from that. And there's so many medical professionals. That's the other thing. It's like, you want to sue the doctors? Okay, go ahead. I mean, I don't want to sue the doctors. But is this, what are you saying? Do you not trust doctors? Do you not trust them? Do you think doctors are like rushing to have, to operate on kids? That's not the case at all. And again, I just think that this is something that people who care about kids do not actually prioritize talking about this.
I think the idea that a lot of kids are being rushed to like the surgeon's knife or something is a little bit of hysterical. I agree with you on that. We might disagree on the kind of what I was saying about the kind of casual erosion of gender having to do with the way educators are being trained. And on that front, wanted to talk about this new San Diego school district teacher training that was obtained by writer Christopher Rufo, conforms to what Rufo identifies as radical gender theory, suggesting that white Europeans created a false gender binary, man and woman, that oppresses trans, non-binary, intersex, gender non-conforming people. These are kind of educational slides that, Rufo finds these from time to time. He's this kind of well-known conservative activist who has uncovered a lot of educational materials some done for corporations, some done by like activist educators, diversity, equity trainings. He did a lot on the race stuff. So he's finding stuff on gender, that's training for teachers. And I think most parents, maybe there's some minority of parents who are like extremely progressive and have no problem with their very young kids being exposed to like kind of radical, I think, is a fair way to describe theories about gender at a young age. Most parents don't want that. Most parents absolutely do not want this in schools from until you have to talk about, literal procreation. You have to have the talk with children at a certain age. But other than that, they don't want like kindergartners exposed to the ideas that like man and woman doesn't exist and this is something white European.
But I think the problem is that we're talking about Chris Rufo, who's kind of notorious for misrepresenting things. I mean, I take him with a grain of salt, like many grains of salt, like enough grains of salt to give me hypertension, and I recommend everyone do that. Not get hypertension, but take what he says with a grain of salt, because he's made claims in the past that have been debunked. He's a real ideologue, an extremely ideological person, and he's very much wants to erode trust in public education. And what's interesting is that I looked at the document that he claims is representing this all-in, San Diego all-in. It's a document, it's called Facilitator Training, Workshops for LGBTQ Youth and Allies. So first of all, it's not necessarily for kids. It's certainly not something that's being used across the board.
It's for the people who are going to teach the kids. There's no proof that it's been funded with city money. Mm-hmm. It seems like maybe it was written for a specific workshop, but he says the district has gone all in on radical gender theory. I could find anything. I could find a training for teachers. There's no proof that he gives that it's actually even being picked up by teachers. I reached out to a friend who lives in San Diego who's a parent, and they reached out to a teacher in San Diego who said, this is anecdotal obviously, but my friend said, I asked an SD teacher, a San Diego
about these docs, and she says she's never seen anything remotely close to that, wouldn't even know where something like that will be made available to her, has nothing to do with her job. So I just think that I could find anything. I went to Wesleyan University. Trust me, I could make a document like that in my sleep. I'm not saying that these aren't real or that they're being created by Rufo necessarily, but I do think that there's no evidence that these are widespread. So you can find anything and say it's problematic. This is a guy who said people were chanting to human sacrifice Aztec gods or something.
I mean, I've criticized Christopher Rufo when I've disagreed with him, but to his credit, he tends to find and produce actual documents, the content of which I think I understand why a reasonable parent would not want teachers being trained by this and then talking to their kids about these subjects. How often is it happening? Maybe not that often. I don't think that it's never happening. I don't think that maybe you do see, not to bring up libs of TikTok or whatever, you do see lots of evidence. I mean, there's so many schools in the country. It could be the case 95% of schools are not touched by this or not having these kinds of teachers, but there are enough anecdotal or enough reported on cases of teachers who want to talk to even very young kids about these subjects. And look, parents don't want that. It's public education. I think parents should have some say over it. They don't want it. So it shouldn't be part of the educational experience for public schools for young kids. Yeah,
I just think that I'm just reading a tweet that Rufo sent, which is basically he's saying with his work on critical race theory, he says the goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with American. If you want to see public policy outcomes, you have to run a public persuasion campaign, which is, okay, this is very honest of him. He's saying basically he's a PR guy. He's kind of a spin doctor, but he's saying it right there. He wants to have people look at any random thing and think it's part of a greater trend, whether it's critical race theory or this gender stuff. So I just think he's good for him for having this open view about being a foot soldier in this culture war. And again, the guy's worked at the Heritage Foundation, at a Christian think tank also. And I think this is great for him, who's definitely invested in making it look like the public education system is filling your kids' heads with, woke radical ideology, which I just don't think is that pervasive at all. And I think that, giving kids the freedom to look at things in different ways that are less gendered is good, but I don't even think that happens that much. I think that he clearly has an agenda, and he's not reliable. And we can also find examples of teaching in the total opposite direction that's much more represented. It's just that we don't have people making their living off of showing that as much.
What do you mean going the other way?
Well, very problematically gendered or...
creationism.
Yeah, which is something...
but that's something... But, okay, that would be my point. But liberals do complain about that and want it not taught.
They do, right. But I guess that those things and that is fair game. It is fair.
I don't know what's more wide. I take your point that maybe it's not as widespread as he's making it sound. In fact, certainly it's not. And that he is an activist, but he has the receipts. He has actual documents.
Yeah, and, I would say he has receipts. The receipts don't represent what he's claiming to have.
Okay.
So it's like, I'm pretending that I bought McDonald's and I show you a Starbucks receipt.
Okay, and got to have that whole pile of salt for our hypertension.
Right, yeah.
All right,
but it is funny how, sorry, I just have one more point. It's they're always saying that the left wants to change language to make people think differently, and this is exactly what Rufo is doing, so good on him.
It is an example of becoming, people who overly obsess over activists eventually come to sound like the people they're obsessed with, which is not a healthy trend, but... good job being a rabid ideologue, Rufo.
Well,
but
that's me, not Robbie. This is a mixed endorsement.
People will call us rabid ideologues in some.
Oh, but I own that. I own that. Yeah,
that's what Rufo's doing.
Yeah.
I'm just a fair, objective, down the middle journalist
are
with no biases.
landing in my lap, as opposed to. He's clearly looking for the most provocative things that he can find that we don't even know if they're being used. So.
Well, check them out for yourselves. They're available on his social media feeds and elsewhere. And we'll continue to discuss them and back with more Rising right after this.